What's happening, guys? And welcome to what we're going to call part one of the Everything Chest segment or video series. I'm so happy to have you here. Obviously, if you're here, you either want to see this pretty mug or you want to learn a little bit of something about the pecs. Either way, the first way, I'm more happy about that. Just kidding. I'm happy you're here in the first place. Before we dive into this, a couple shameless plugs. First thing is go into the comments. I put a little special link in there for you guys to have a special offer to the Execution program on the Execution Pro website. It is the first link that you will see in the comments. Click on that bad boy. See if that is something that you are interested in. Second thing is, I'm going to be doing more of these videos, okay? Some of them are going to be private like this one is, so I appreciate you being here for the VIP access. That makes me super, super happy. But I'm also going to be doing some public videos here on YouTube that's going to be breaking down some mechanics of exercise where I'm going to be the test dummy. So basically, I'm going to be the trainer and I'm going to be the trainee, and I'm going to be picking apart my working sets. This is definitely something that you guys can learn from because there's just some magic that comes in seeing application, getting that light bulb aha moment and being able to apply to yourself. So that's the first two things that I wanted to talk about. Now into the fun stuff. We're only on part one of the video series, and in part one, we're going to talk about anatomy and function. Now that seems really, really boring, but the reality is this is the start. We have to start somewhere to get a better understanding of how do we go into the gym and be a little bit better at training our chest with any kind of problem that you're currently having. And there's a wide array of them. But a lot of the stuff that we hear about chest training is, I don't feel my chest, my front delts seem to take over, they seem to overtake chest exercises, particularly most of the time in presses, or I have shoulder pain. Like when I press, when I fly, when I do my chest training, when I do dips, anything I do for chest, it just seems to give me shoulder pain or elbow pain. What am I doing wrong? It has to start here. And I will show you, okay? The way that I describe anatomy and function is that this doesn't have to be your college major. And you don't have to have any kind of background in it. But what you need to have is an understanding of where a muscle starts, where it finishes, and the influence that has on the way that your body actually functions. So the anatomy basically is me talking about insertion point and origin point, okay? And always, anytime we're talking about muscular things like this, we need to learn about contractions, because the reality is when you go into the gym and you train, we're not training exercises. Exercises are a result of a specific contraction. And a contraction is always, 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 always the insertion point going to the origin. So what you're going to see up here is two pictures. We're going to spend the majority of the time on this first picture. The first picture here is our pectoralis major, or our major superficial top chest muscle. It's the one that we see the most. It's the one we train the most. It's the one we're most concerned about. Okay, so that is this picture here. And then as a bonus, I figured why not do the Pec Minor? Because guess what? Knowing where the Pec Minor is and its influence on what happens with the Pec Major and its influence on your structure can be super important if you're having problems training your chest as well. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to get a little bit into the anatomy. So let me get one of my handy dandy markers here. We'll stick with, let's do this pink one here. Pretty pink on a pretty pink day. Guys, don't question my masculinity. I'm still masculine. I just have a pink marker because it came as part of the packet and it's going to stick out here, okay? So I'm still a dude. I'm still a guy. Just kidding. Anyway, okay, so we're getting into the Pec Major here. Now, we need to know what does this muscle do, but in order for us to understand what the muscle does from a contractile standpoint, we have to understand where does it start and where does it finish. So the chest is a very unique muscle group because what we call it is a converging fan-shaped muscle group. And where it gets that name from is that it has multiple lines of pull of multiple muscle fibers. It's a little bit more complex than if we were going to break down the biceps, which have one direction in which the muscle fibers actually pull. But the important thing to realize here is that every muscle in your body is comprised of, I venture to say hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of muscle fibers, okay? And they do have the ability, based on their origin and how broad that contact is, to have an influence of pulling in different directions, which will directly influence your setup into exercises, and that's why it's important. The origin of the chest has 3 different spots where it will attach. The largest contact of origin is along this guy here. It is along our sternum. And hopefully you guys are able to read this. This is basically a chest here, and this is its fibers. This is your sternum. This is your collarbone or your clavicle. This is your upper arm. This is your humerus. And then these guys down here and in here are your ribs, okay? So we have our sternum here. And basically the start of the pecs is in 1 of 3 places. The largest contact of origin is here on the sternum. Here, all right? The second is going to be on the collarbone. Here, okay? And the third is going to be at the upper part of the ribs here, all right? And what you can see is I've drew lines all to the same dot on the upper arm or the humerus. That is our insertion point, okay? So insertion is here and origin is in 1 of those 3 places. Remember how I said here a couple minutes ago that insertion always pulls toward origin to shorten or contract a muscle group closer to its completely contracted, shortened position, where it's weak, but also where it's more neurologically active. So what does that mean? Well, my chest has the ability to pull in this direction, the upper arm, or this direction, or this direction, or this direction, and everything in between. It has a wide array of pulling the humerus into different spots, sternum, ribs, or clavicle. Does that make sense so far? Hopefully that should be pretty clear. And guys, I call that connecting the dots. We have dot A, which is our insertion point, and we need to pick where it needs to go to connect to dot B. Contracting muscles and picking exercises is no more than picking an application to connect the dots very specifically. If you guys can learn that, trust me, once you get the connection, you get your setups right in an exercise application, the sky is really the limit on how far you can progress exercise in your training. And I'm just telling you that from personal experience, okay? So our Pec Major, in terms of that, has a large array of origin that has the ability to pull the humerus in different ranges of motion, different lines of pull, and that's what makes that muscle group fan shaped. So what does that have as far as an influence on function? That's the anatomy. We know the insertion point. We know the origin. We're aware that the insertion point pulls to different parts of origination of that pec. But as far as function goes, we have a little bit of an understanding of anatomy. What about function? What does it do to the upper arm? What do the pecs do in general? Does it really matter? Well, yeah, you should have a little bit of an understanding of what they do. The first thing that they do is they adduct the upper arm. I'm gonna put the humerus, okay? So adduct means middle line, and upper arm means in. They pull the upper arm into the body. So when we talk about pressing, it's important to understand the function of the pecs, because the pecs don't press forward, they pull in. So the resultant of my fist going in through the ceiling or in line with gravity or pushing a dumbbell through space is simply by my thought process of my upper arm needs to either go into my sternum, or it needs to go into my clavicle, or it needs to go down into the ribs. So making sense so far? And the carryover is the same thing with the fly. The only difference with the fly is that your arm's a little longer, and it's going to be a longer circular motion. Hopefully that makes sense for you. So that's why knowing function is a little bit important. The secondary function is kind of a resultant of knowing what the attachment point or the insertion is on the humerus. So it's slightly on like the outside part of the humerus. Even though you can't see it, it's kind of important to know that. And the reason why is because it does a little bit of internal rotation. So since that insertion point is here, if I went into the sternum here and that insertion point's out here, if I rotate it in, is that dot getting closer to this dot? The answer to that is yes. So you can see that contracts my pec a little bit more. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit for emphasis, but that internal rotation is a secondary factor. And those are really the 2 functions that you need to be concerned about in regards to your training. So you guys can already see that if I take this concept of, instead of pushing through a bar or pushing through dumbbells or pulling through a machine, and I start thinking upper arm into sternum, or upper arm into collarbone, or upper arm down into ribs, and then maybe if the application fits, like in some cable exercises or the pec deck fly, I add a little bit of internal rotation, I'm going to feel my pecs more in the contraction. And it's the same thing in the stretch. When I stretch, I'm not worried about how far that dumbbell goes down or far out that cable goes. I want to get that insertion point as far away from my point of origin that I have picked to train in, whether it's in the collarbone or down in the ribs. I want to get those dots as close together as I can to make a clean contraction, and as far away from each other to make a clean stretch. And that is how we identify how far we can actively stretch a muscle before it loses tension or before we have the tendency to compensate. Oftentimes when people can't feel a muscle, and when they long-term or short-term have pain or discomfort, it's because they're not having a good awareness of what that muscle function is. And that muscle function is automatically going to have you start to think more about this mind-muscle connection and less about a movement. Everything that you do from a contractile standpoint has to be less about moving through space and more about a specific contraction based off of what that muscle was built and designed to do for you. The only difference between everyday life and then going into the gym and training a specific muscle group is that you're putting the rest of your body in the disadvantage and you're putting that muscle in the advantage to do only the work, which is energy expensive and it's not functional to everyday life, but it's the only way to really fully tax that muscle with effort. But in order to get effort, you need tension. In order to get tension, you need to learn how to get output in it. And to get output, you have to understand the anatomy, origin and insertion. You have to understand the function. Pretty simple, right guys? Okay, this is your class session. This is your study session. Understand those concepts, okay? Broad origin of contact pulls the upper arm into any point on that origin, okay? And it might have a slight bit of internal rotation if the application fits, all right? Now, we hear this thing all the time about shoulder blades, and that is the reason why I put the Pec Minor in there. So as you can see, the Pec Major doesn't attach to the shoulder blades, but there's always this argument about like, should I keep my shoulder blades fixed? Should I keep them retracted? Should I keep them depressed? Should I allow my shoulder blades to move? Should I not have to worry about my shoulder blades? Is it unsafe for them? You know, like we think about all those things. There's questions like that out there. Well, I want to draw a little bit of clarity to that. We have a second chest group that nobody ever talks about. That second part of your chest is called your pectoralis minor or your Pec Minor, okay? And now, this is another picture. So imagine right here, this is your sternum. This is me here, and this is the scapula out here, all right? This right here will kind of be your shoulder joint and the humerus going out there, if that makes sense, okay? We have the top superficial part of the scapula, okay? There's a little ridge up there. That's where the origin of the Pec Minor starts. And then we have those ribs, kind of like these guys on this side. We have these ribs, and the pecs attached to 3 of those ribs as far as the Pec Minor goes. So we have a Pec Minor that attaches to the front and then spans to the back, okay? And now, what that tells you is, if my scapula moves in any direction, it's going to have an influence on whether those pecs decide to stretch or decide to contract. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so let's think about this right now, all right? I need, the way my body is designed to function is I need this guy, the Pec Major, and the Pec Minor when I go into my load-based bread and butter exercises, pretty much any exercise you do in the gym, and I do it for pecs. I need these guys to work in synchronicity with each other to where they're seamlessly working together, but I also have to put them in the position to where they're anchored and safe so that they can function at a high level. We already understand what the function of the Pec Major is. My only thought process to keep the Pec Major safe is upper arm away from origin, upper arm into origin. It's really that simple. Everything else is a resultant of that thought process. But what do I do with the shoulder blades knowing that the Pec Minor goes into that spot? Well, first of all, if I'm in some kind of a press or I'm on a bench, then even though I have the pressure of that load pushing my scapula into that bench, I need to put it in a spot where the inside of that scapula feels braced so that the outside of the scapula can function. So if the inside, I'm sorry, that's terrible. That's the wrong way. If the inside of my scapula has these things called traps, these are my traps, and these are my mid traps. These are my upper traps. These are my lower traps, okay? They are deep to those ribs that I have drawn there. I need to make sure that these guys are as braced as possible. So they are pulling in to the spine, pulling into the spine. So they're pulling the scapula in this direction, all right? What that's doing is that's going to anchor that scapula, not that it's fixed, but that once this guy decides to stretch and a press and maybe slightly elevate or contract through a press, which means stretch and a press, contract through a press, that pec minor can stretch with the scapula. Even though the scapula is braced, it's not fixed, but it can move. See how it moves still? But my traps are still tight, okay? So it can move, pec minor can stretch, and as I press, no problem. Scapula maybe will slightly move so that those pecs can contract. This is why anatomy is important. I know that these muscle fibers are going to pull that scapula down if I do a press, okay? I also know that there's the potential that my shoulder blades, if this is my torso, my shoulder blades may have this sensation to want to pull around my torso in a fly. Is that bad? Absolutely not. What that's telling me is that my pec minor has to pull on that scapula because it attaches to it. So if I want to get this pec major to get to a fully shortened position in the fly, I got to let the pec minor do its job. Does it make sense? So to answer your question, guys, should my scapula move? Yes, it should move, but it needs to be anchored. So anchor it with those mid and lower traps. Go ahead and brace them, contract them. It has nothing to do with retraction and depression, it has everything to do with bracing. Get them to contract, contract, contract. I'm not really forcing anything down, I'm just going, can I feel them? I feel them right there, I feel them right there. Look what happens to my pecs when I brace automatically. They already pop. Why? Because they're getting an anchor to the scapula on the traps. The pec minor goes, hey, brain, I'm okay, I'm ready to move, I'm ready to contract. It contracts. Pec major says, hey, pec minor's safe, I can contract too. And then it automatically pops. That's what this is, guys. That's the same resultant that happens in the initiation of any press and any fly. When things are safe on the inside, things on the outside work. But you're not going to get an understanding of how to set up properly or what's good and what's bad until you start at the foundation and the fundamentals of training. And that always starts in anatomy. And then knowing anatomy, how does that influence function? Okay, the last thing I want to cover with the pec minor, then we're going to close this guy, is what if I want to train the pec minor directly? What if I want to bias it? Is that good? Is that bad? Is it something I need to focus on? Well, maybe if you have limitation of your shoulder joint, right? Your pec minor is one of the muscles that make up like that rotator cuff. So if I have a weakness in internal rotation, external rotation, elevation, depression, if I feel gummy or wonky, or if I'm looking to just kind of prime myself for pec work, for pec major work, can I do something with pec minor? The answer to that is absolutely yes. Okay, well, how do I do that? It goes back to anatomy, and then it goes back to how does that influence function, and then what do I do as far as an exercise application, knowing the function. So this is the direction that those fibers go, right? And they attach to the ribs. So I'm connecting dot A, insertion, to dot B, origin. This is the way that they're going to pull. They're going to pull up to the top of those shoulder blades in order to get more contracted. So what do? Shoulder blades down into ribs, right? Get those dots closer. Separate the shoulders away from the ribs. Shoulder blades into ribs. Separate the shoulders away from the ribs. So what's the pec minor do? Okay, it pulls, boom, and boom. That's all it does, okay? Depression with slight internal rotation, elevation with slight retraction. That's how to lengthen and shorten that pec minor. What can you do that in? Well, you can do that in any kind of dip setting. If I get my chest and my ribs in kind of alignment with that dip, look how comfortably I can elevate and depress. Watch my pecs contract in the bottom every time here. Shorten pec minor. Lengthen pec minor. Shorten pec, or we can do it in a fly motion. Lengthen pec minor, pretty close to shorten, or shorten. Lengthen pec minor, elevation, depression, Upper arm coming into the ribs, right? Shoulder blades pulling down into the ribs. Boom. Pretty simple, guys. The only reason why I even know exercises that apply isn't because I've gone and experimented in the gym. It's because I know the tools that it will take in order to exercise that function, knowing a little bit of anatomy about my Pec Minor and my Pec Major. So hopefully that adds some clarity right there, guys. That's step one, and that's your class session for today. Part two, I've got it written on the board so that I don't forget. Part two is basically going to be everything about structure and alignment. So we have all this down, but we also have to realize that I'm built differently than my neighbor on this side and on this side. I also have different mobility issues than my neighbor on this side and on this side. So I need to be able to assess myself and my structure. I'm more than just two-dimensional. It is just connecting dots, but I also have all of this torso to work around. So I need to be able to figure out how can I test for those things, or how can I ensure that I'm at least giving my pecs a chance. And that's basically the step from going education and theory to application. So this is the fun part, guys. You guys have laid the groundwork. You had the internal visual that you're looking for. Now you just need to learn how to apply it and take a big step forward. That's what part two is going to be about. Don't miss it. Before I forget, guys, subscribe to the channel. There's going to be more videos to come. It's going to be something that I'm going to be more active with because, again, my purpose is to educate you as much as I can on things like this and everything to do with training. So if this is something that you like, and I hope you do, subscribe right now. And I look forward, and you should too, to talking to you in part two. Thanks.